Picture this. For 3,000 years, the Volani Confederation had been living what you'd call the perfect life. These weren't just any aliens we're talking about here. Imagine beings made of living crystal. So beautiful, they look like they stepped right out of a fantasy movie. Their entire civilization floated above massive gas giant planets and cities that sparkled like diamonds against a cosmic backdrop. The Volani had figured out something most species never do: true peace. They spent their days meditating, creating incredible art, and using their natural psychic powers to actually communicate with the planets and stars around them. Think of it like having a conversation with nature itself. Their ships weren't built for war or conquest. Instead, these bio-vessels were living works of art that could grow and heal themselves, designed purely for exploration and discovering new beauty in the universe. For 3 millennia, they explored the galaxy not as conquerors but as cosmic gardeners, helping other species develop their own peaceful societies. They had 17 star systems under their care, each one more stunning than the last. Life was good. Life was perfect. Then everything changed in the worst possible way. The hive swarms came from the dark spaces between galaxies, places so empty and cold that most species assumed nothing could survive there. But these things didn't just survive, they thrived on destruction. Picture the most terrifying insect you could imagine, then make it the size of a city and give it an endless appetite for everything living. That's what the Volani suddenly found themselves facing. These weren't your typical science fiction bad guys with some complex motivation or tragic backstory. The hive swarms had one purpose: consume everything. They moved from world to world like a plague of cosmic locusts, stripping planets bare of every living thing. Trees, grass, animals, people. It all went into their massive bioships to fuel their endless expansion across the universe. When the first reports came in, Admiral Kesthyra thought there had to be some mistake. She was standing in her crystal command spire on Nymos Prime, the capital world, when emergency broadcasts started flooding in. The outer colonies weren't just under attack. They were being devoured. The Volani tried to fight back with everything they had. Their beautiful bioships, creatures of art and grace, flew out to meet this nightmare. But imagine bringing a butterfly to fight a chainsaw. The hive vessels were living nightmares, all teeth and claws and hunger, designed by evolution to be perfect killing machines. Every elegant Volani ship that engaged them got torn apart like paper in a hurricane. Admiral Kesthyra watched in horror as 6 entire colonies simply vanished from her sensors. Billions of lives gone. Worlds that had taken thousands of years to terraform and cultivate, reduced to lifeless rocks in a matter of hours. The swarms didn't even leave ruins behind. They consumed everything, right down to the basic organic compounds in the soil. The Confederation's military leaders called emergency meetings. But what could they do? Their entire philosophy was built around peace and harmony. They had no weapons of mass destruction, no military doctrine for total war, no experience with an enemy that couldn't be reasoned with or understood. The hive swarms didn't want territory or resources in any conventional sense. They just wanted to eat everything and move on. As the enemy fleets pushed deeper into Confederation space, Admiral Kesthyra made the hardest decision of her long life. She activated the ancient quantum communication beacons, devices left behind by some forgotten civilization eons ago. These beacons could send messages across impossible distances, reaching every corner of the galaxy instantly. The message was simple and desperate. We are dying. Our worlds are being consumed. If any species in the galaxy has the power to help us, please come. We offer everything we have in exchange for survival. The psychic screams of dying worlds amplified the message, sending waves of terror and desperation rippling across space faster than light itself. Every telepathic species in the galaxy felt the Volani's anguish, but most were too far away or too weak to help against such a threat. Days passed. The swarms kept advancing, consuming world after world. Just when all hope seemed lost, the quantum beacons detected something unexpected. A response signal coming from the galactic rim, from a region most civilized species considered uninhabitable. Something had heard their prayers. Something was coming. But the Volani had no idea what kind of salvation they had just called down upon themselves. When those first sensor readings came through showing an approaching fleet from the Galactic Rim, you can imagine a wave of relief that swept through the Volani Confederation. After days of watching their beautiful worlds get consumed by the hive swarms, finally someone had answered their desperate calls for help. The quantum beacons had worked. Salvation was coming. But as the fleet got closer and the sensor readings became clearer, Admiral Kestira felt her hopes start to turn into confusion, and then into something approaching horror. These weren't the ships of some advanced, enlightened civilization coming to rescue them from evil. These were the ugliest, most brutal-looking vessels she had ever seen. Where Volani's ships were living art, flowing and organic with curves that seemed to dance through space, these newcomer vessels looked like someone had taken chunks of raw metal and welded them together with pure aggression in mind. No graceful lines, no harmony with the cosmos, no integration with living systems. Just angular, industrial death machines bristling with more weapons than the entire Confederation had built in 3,000 years of peaceful existence. The ships moved wrong, too. Volani vessels glided through space like cosmic dancers, but these things cut to the void like predators stalking prey. Every movement was calculated, efficient, and utterly terrifying in its mechanical precision. You could feel the violence radiating from them even across the vast emptiness of space. Captain Jake Mitchell stood on the bridge of his flagship, a massive dreadnought that the Volani would have considered an abomination against the natural order of things. Around him, his crew worked with the kind of casual efficiency that comes from growing up in places where making a mistake means everyone dies. These weren't philosopher warriors or enlightened peacekeepers. These were working-class soldiers from the Outer Rim colonies, places so dangerous that children learned to handle weapons before they could properly walk. Through his view screen, Jake watched the elegant Volani city ships getting torn apart by the hive swarms like tissue paper in a hurricane. The crystalline structures that had taken centuries to grow were being ripped to pieces in seconds. It was honestly painful to watch such beautiful craftsmanship getting destroyed, but Jake had seen worse. Much worse. The psychic death screams of the dying Volani were so intense, they actually knocked out several of his own telepathic crew members. These weren't just deaths. They were the agonized final thoughts of an entire peaceful civilization being consumed alive. The pain was so overwhelming that his ship's psychic dampeners started overloading trying to filter it out. Most species would have been paralyzed by the sheer horror of what they were witnessing. The hive ships weren't just big. They were living nightmares the size of cities, covered in organic armor that could heal itself and weapons that adapted to whatever you threw at them. They consumed everything in their path, growing larger and more powerful with each world they devoured. But Jake Mitchell had grown up on Kepler 442b, a world where the weather could kill you. The wildlife was actively trying to eat you, and the colonists considered a good day to be one where less than 5% of the population died from environmental hazards. He'd fought in the Titan Wars, where human colonies battled each other over resources in conditions that would make most species curl up and wait for death. To Jake and his crew, the hive swarms were certainly dangerous, but they weren't anything they hadn't faced before. Different scale, same principle. Something wants to kill you, so you kill it first. His tactical officer, Lieutenant Amy Foster, had already run preliminary scans on the enemy vessels. Born and raised on Europa Station, she'd learned combat analysis while dodging radiation storms that could cook your brain in seconds. "Sir," she reported with the kind of calm that only comes from a lifetime of facing impossible odds, "looks like standard organic adaptive armor. Nasty, but nothing we haven't dealt with before." Jake nodded. His fleet had come out here on what was supposed to be a routine supply run to the Rim colonies. They'd picked up the Volani distress call purely by accident. Their long-range sensors had caught the quantum beacon transmissions while they were refueling at a mining station. The logical thing would have been to report it to Colonial Command and let someone else handle it. But Jake's grandfather had been one of the first colonists to survive the Outer Rim expansion, and the old man had taught him something important. When someone's in trouble and you have the power to help, you help. It doesn't matter if they're human or alien, friend or stranger. You do what's right. Now, looking at the hive swarms tearing through the Volani capital system, Jake was about to show these cosmic locusts exactly what humans from the death worlds were capable of when properly motivated. The Volani had prayed for salvation. They were about to get something much more dangerous and much more effective. The moment Captain Jake Mitchell gave the order to open fire, the entire dynamic of the battle changed in ways that nobody could have predicted. What had been a one-sided massacre of peaceful Volani ships suddenly became something completely different, a demonstration of exactly why most civilized species avoid the Galactic Rim territories. Jake's dreadnought spoke first, its main railguns launching solid tungsten rounds of velocities that made light itself seem slow. These weren't elegant energy weapons or graceful plasma bolts like most advanced species used. This was pure kinetic energy. Chunks of dense metal accelerated to a significant fraction of light speed and aimed with mechanical precision at the nearest hive vessel. When those rounds hit, the effect was spectacular and terrible. The organic armor that had shrugged off Volani bioweapons like they were gentle raindrops suddenly found itself dealing with impacts that released more energy than small nuclear weapons. Entire sections of the hive ship simply ceased to exist, vaporized by the sheer physics of the collision. But Jake's fleet was just getting started. Nuclear torpedoes followed the kinetic strikes. Not the clean fusion weapons that most civilized species might use, but dirty, brutal fission warheads designed to crack asteroids and moonlets during mining operations. These weren't precision instruments of war. They were industrial tools repurposed for violence, and the radiation signatures they left behind would make those areas of space uninhabitable for decades. The particle beam arrays came online next, focusing streams of superheated plasma hot enough to cut through starship hulls like a blowtorch through paper. The humans had learned to build these weapons while fighting in the radiation-soaked space around dying stars, where normal energy weapons would fail within minutes of activation. Aboard the Volani evacuation ships, Admiral Kesthyra watched this display of raw destruction with mixture relief and absolute horror. These humans weren't just fighting the hive swarms. They were systematically dismantling them with weapons that violated every treaty about civilized warfare she had ever heard of. The sheer brutality of it made her crystalline form tremble. But here's what really shocked everyone, including the hive swarms themselves. For the first time in their species' million-year history of consuming entire civilizations, the swarms actually hesitated. These organic nightmares that had devoured countless worlds suddenly found themselves facing something they had never encountered before, prey that hit back harder than they did. The swarms had evolved their tactics over eons of consuming peaceful species. They expected resistance, sure, but it was always the same pattern. Initial shock, desperate defense, gradual adaptation to their regenerative abilities, and then inevitable consumption. They had never met a species that opened negotiations with weapons designed to crack planets. Lieutenant Amy Foster was monitoring the tactical situation from her assault ship when the order came through for boarding operations. Any sane military doctrine would have avoided close-quarters combat with regenerating bioships full of creatures designed to consume organic matter. But Amy had grown up on Europa Station, where close quarters meant fighting in maintenance tunnels barely wider than your shoulders, while cosmic radiation tried to cook you from the outside. "All right, Marines," she announced over the comm system. "Looks like we're going fishing in alien digestive systems. Standard breach and clear protocols. Remember, these things eat people, so try not to get eaten." Her boarding teams launched from their assault ships in powered armor that looked more like miniature tanks than spacesuits. These weren't the elegant, environmentally integrated systems that most species used. Human combat armor was designed with one principle in mind: keep the person inside alive no matter what the universe threw at them. Radiation shielding, life support systems that could function in hard vacuum for hours, and enough firepower to level city blocks. The breach charges they used to get inside the hive vessels were originally designed for asteroid mining. Controlled explosions meant to crack open rocks the size of mountains. When they went off against organic hull material, the results were predictably messy. Inside the hive ships, Amy's Marines found themselves in what could only be described as a living nightmare. The corridors were actually digestive passages, designed to break down consumed organic matter. The walls secreted acids that could dissolve most known materials. Creatures that looked like they crawled out of humanity's worst nightmares scuttled through the organic architecture, designed by evolution to be perfect killing machines. The Volani, monitoring the boarding operations through their psychic senses, could barely comprehend what they were witnessing. The humans weren't just surviving inside these death traps. They were systematically clearing them out room by room, corridor by corridor, using tactics that seemed to assume the environment was actively trying to kill them. Because for humans from the Outer Rim colonies, that was just Tuesday. They'd grown up in places where the air was toxic, the water would kill you, and the local wildlife considered humans a delicious snack. Fighting inside a giant alien digestive system was certainly unpleasant, but wasn't anything they couldn't handle with proper equipment and the right attitude. The battle raged for 3 days across the entire star system, and the humans fought with the kind of relentless efficiency that comes from growing up in places where making mistakes means everyone dies. They didn't fight like noble warriors or enlightened defenders of justice. They fought like exterminators dealing with a particularly dangerous pest problem. And the universe was about to learn exactly how effective human pest control could be. By the second day of the battle, something fascinating and terrifying started happening. The hive swarms, these ancient predators that had consumed countless civilizations across the galaxy, began doing what they always did when faced with resistance. They adapted. Their bioships started growing thicker armor in response to the kinetic rounds. Their regenerative systems began working faster to counter the nuclear strikes. Their organic weapons evolved new configurations to match human tactics. This was their signature move, the reason they had been unstoppable for millions of years. Every species they'd encountered would throw everything they had at the swarms, watch their weapons become less effective, and then despair as their defenses crumbled. It was a tried and tested formula for galactic domination. But the hive swarms had never encountered human military doctrine before. And humans, you see, had a very different approach to escalation. When Commander Tom Bradley noticed his conventional weapons losing effectiveness, he didn't panic or call for retreat. He simply moved to the next level of his arsenal. Growing up on Proxima Centauri B, where the local bacteria could dissolve human tissue in minutes, and the plant life actively hunted colonists, Tom had learned early that when something adapts to your current method of killing it, you find a new method. The bioweapons he authorized weren't the elegant, targeted systems that civilized species might develop. These were industrial-grade biological agents originally designed for terraforming hostile worlds, organisms that could break down any organic matter they encountered, modified for combat deployment. When Tom gave the order to deploy them, every Villani telepath in the system had to shield their minds from the sheer cold brutality of the decision. The hive ships started dying from the inside out as the bioweapons tore through their living hulls like acid through paper. But even then, some of the larger vessels began adapting, developing immunity systems faster than anyone thought possible. So Tom escalated again. The antimatter charges weren't even military weapons originally. They were mining tools designed to crack apart rogue asteroids that threatened shipping lanes. Each charge contained enough antimatter to annihilate several city blocks worth of matter in a flash of pure energy. When they started detonating inside hive vessels, the explosions were visible from 3 star systems away. Lieutenant Amy Foster, coordinating the assault from her command ship, watched the tactical display with the kind of professional interest that comes from years of fighting in impossible conditions. "Sir," she reported to Tom, "some of the larger bioships are still regenerating faster than we can damage them, the motherships especially." This was the moment that really showed the difference between human thinking and how most species approach warfare. Any civilized military would have started looking for diplomatic solutions, or perhaps called for reinforcements, or begun planning a strategic withdrawal. Tom Bradley looked at the regenerating enemy vessels and started calculating ramming speeds. All ships with critical damage, he broadcast on the fleet frequency, prepare for collision protocols. We're going to use ourselves as kinetic weapons. Captain Lisa Harper was commanding a destroyer that had taken a direct hit from a high bioweapon. Her engines were failing. Life support was running on backup power, and hull breaches were venting atmosphere across 3 decks. Any reasonable person would have abandoned ship and hoped for rescue. Instead, Lisa ordered her crew to the escape pods and pointed her dying vessel directly at the largest hive mothership in the system. She'd grown up on Kepler, for 38b, where the gravity was so strong that a fall from table height could kill you, and the atmosphere contained trace amount of compounds that would slowly dissolve your lungs. Lisa had spent her childhood learning that when you're going to die anyway, you might as well take your enemies with you. Her destroyer, loaded with stellar mining charges repurposed as the galaxy's most illegal weapons of mass destruction, slammed into the Hive mothership at nearly 10% of light speed. The explosion was so massive it created a miniature star for about 3 seconds, vaporizing not just a target vessel, but 2 other Hive ships that happened to be nearby. The shockwave and debris field trapped another dozen enemy vessels, making them sitting ducks for the rest of the human fleet. The Villani telepaths had to completely shut down their psychic senses to avoid being overwhelmed by the sheer intensity of human tactical thinking. These weren't noble warriors following some ancient code of honor. These weren't enlightened beings fighting for justice and peace. These were problem solvers from Deathworlds, treating an extinction-level galactic threat like a particularly stubborn maintenance issue. From their perspective, it wasn't even personal. The Hive swarms were just another environmental hazard, like toxic atmosphere or radiation storms or carnivorous plants. You identified the problem, you found the most efficient way to eliminate it, and then you moved on with your day. Commander Tom Bradley, watching his tactical display as Hive vessels continue to die in increasingly spectacular explosions, may have noted his log that they were running low on antimatter charges and would need to requisition more from a mining consortium when they got back to base. He treated the extinction of an ancient galactic menace like a supply chain problem. The Hive swarms, for their part, were experiencing something completely unprecedented in their species' history. For the first time in millions of years of evolution, they were encountering prey that was more dangerous than they were. Every time they adapted to human weapons, the humans simply moved to something worse. They had expected to consume another peaceful civilization. Instead, they'd run into exterminators who considered overkill a professional virtue. When the final Hive ship's burning remains spiraled down into Thymo's Prime's atmosphere like a dying comet, Admiral Kestire felt something she hadn't experienced in days' silence. Not just the absence of weapons fire or the screaming of dying bioships, but actual psychic quiet. For the first time since this nightmare began, the galaxy wasn't filled with the death cries of her people. The Villani survivors gathered in their remaining city ships, preparing for what they assumed would be a momentous meeting with their saviors. In their culture, great deeds required great ceremonies. Heroes were honored with crystal sculptures that would last for millennia, their names sung in harmonious telepathic choruses that could be heard across star systems. Surely these incredible warriors who had just prevented the extinction of their entire civilization would expect something equally magnificent. Admiral Kesthyra selected her finest ceremonial robes, woven from crystalline fibers that had taken decades to grow. She gathered gifts that represented the pinnacle of Villani artistry, living sculptures that could respond to emotions, musical instruments that played melodies composed of pure psychic energy, and data crystals containing 3,000 years of their greatest philosophical insights. She approached the human flagship with a delegation of the Confederation's most honored survivors, expecting to meet noble warrior philosophers, perhaps ancient beings who had spent lifetimes mastering the arts of war and peace. In her mind, she pictured wise commanders standing in halls filled with battle standards and monuments to fallen heroes, ready to receive the grateful thanks of saved civilization. Instead, she found Captain Jake Mitchell in what humans apparently called a mess hall, a utilitarian room with metal tables and chairs that looked like they'd been built for pure function rather than beauty. Jake was sitting alone at one of these tables, eating something from a metallic pouch while staring at a glowing tablet, occasionally making notes with what appeared to be a basic stylus. This was not what she had expected from the commander of a fleet that had just casually erased an extinction-level threat from a galaxy. Jake looked up when she entered, and Kesthyra was struck by how ordinary he seemed. No ceremonial armor, no weapons of state, no aura of mystical warrior wisdom. He was wearing what appeared to be a simple uniform, slightly rumpled from 3 days of combat operations, and his hair was messy in a way that suggested he hadn't bothered looking in a mirror recently. "Thanks for the help," Kesthyra began, her translator converting her musical telepathic communication into human speech. She gestured to her attendants, who stepped forward with their precious gifts. "Please accept these tokens of our eternal gratitude. You have saved not just our civilization, but countless others who have fallen to the swarms." Jake glanced up from his tablet, and she could see he was working on what looked like paperwork. Casualty reports, supply inventories, maintenance schedules. The mundane administrative work that apparently followed even the most incredible military victories. "No problem," he said, and Kesthyra's translator actually had trouble processing the casual tone. "We were heading this direction anyway. Supply run to the Outer Rim colonies." This was just a minor detour. A minor detour. He had just described the salvation of galactic civilization as a minor detour. Kesthyra tried again, thinking perhaps she hadn't made herself clear. "But surely you understand the magnitude of what you've accomplished. The hive swarms had never been stopped before. They consumed entire galactic sectors. Your victory will be remembered for millennia." Jake nodded politely and took another bite of his rations. "Yeah, nasty things. We've dealt with similar problems in the outer territories. Different scale, same basic principle." He gestured at his tablet. "Lost about 30% of the fleet, but that's not too bad considering we were improvising most of our tactics. Could have been worse. 30% fleet losses, and he was discussing it like a supply shortage or a scheduling conflict. Kesthyra began to realize she was dealing with something completely outside her understanding of how the universe worked. Lieutenant Amy Foster entered the mess hall, carrying her own tablet and looking like she'd just finished a routine maintenance shift rather than 3 days of the most brutal combat in galactic history. "Captain, we've finished cataloging the salvageable hive technology. Most of it's too specialized for our purposes, but the engineering teams think they can adapt some of the bio-armor principles for mining operations in hostile environments." Jake nodded. "Good. Make sure we file the proper reports with Colonial Research Division. They like to keep track of new technologies we run across." He turned back to Kesthyra. "Sorry, where were we? Oh, right. You were thanking us. Really, it's no big deal. We're used to dealing with hostile environments." As the reality of the situation began to sink in, Kesthyra understood something that fundamentally changed her view of the galaxy. These humans hadn't come to save the Villani out of some noble calling or heroic destiny. They hadn't even considered it a particularly difficult challenge. To them, the hive swarms were just another occupational hazard, like bad weather or equipment failures. The Confederation had spent 3,000 years believing they lived in a civilized galaxy where the biggest threats were philosophical disagreements and resource allocation disputes. They had built their entire society around the assumption that peace and harmony were the natural order of things. But these humans came from places so dangerous that galactic extinction events were considered minor inconveniences. They had grown up in environments where the air could kill you, the ground would dissolve your feet, and the local wildlife considered humans a dietary supplement. From their perspective, the Villani's peaceful paradise wasn't a pinnacle of civilization, it was a low-threat environment. Jake was already gathering up his paperwork, clearly ready to move on with his day. His crew had started preparations for departure, treating the aftermath of saving galactic civilization like the end of any other work shift. They had schedules to keep, supplies to deliver, and apparently this little detour to prevent universal extinction had only cost them a few days. As the human fleet prepared to leave, Kesthyra realized the most terrifying truth of all. Somewhere out there in the galaxy's death worlds, there were entire civilizations of beings like this, casually dealing with threats that would end most species just as a matter of routine. The universe, she understood now, was far more dangerous and far stranger than her people had ever imagined. And somehow, that actually made her feel safer. Retry